You're watching The Sports Objective, the podcast for Pirates. You're listening to Absolute Empowerment with Coach Jeff Connors on The Sports Objective. Join Coach C, the USA Strength and Conditioning Hall of Famer, every Monday night to see in a variety of guests, including former players, former and current coaches, pastors, and others will discuss relevant issues in coaching today's athlete, with the goal of equipping the athlete and those coaching them with the physical, mental, and spiritual armor necessary to live their best life. Here's Coach Connors.
Welcome to Absolute Empowerment. I'm Coach Connors, and today we have Schexnayder back in the house with us. Well-known coach across the United States of America and the world, coach and speed specialist, and now we're getting together for part 2 of how to become faster in a linear and also a lateral sense. So welcome to the show today, Boo.
Hey, Jeff, how you doing? It's always good to see you.
Doing great. Good to see you. And before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and recognize our sponsor for 2024. Our sponsor is going to be Ed Watkins Marine. And Ed Watkins is an athlete that I had the privilege of coaching at East Carolina University. He was probably the most enthusiastic and positive athlete I've ever coached. And I'm sure he's bringing those characteristics to his business. So very happy to help to have him sponsoring the show, and want to recognize him before we get started. Thank you. Boo, before we get rolling here, let's talk a little bit about what we talked about last time. A couple things came to mind. We were talking about off-season training, and through my career, kind of the standard was in the off-season to have a deload on the 4th week. And because we had shorter training cycles, and even if we had a longer training period, I was wondering about what you thought about that very common standard that had been used by pretty much every coach in the country, the deload on the 4th week.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement there. Before we get started, thanks, Ed Watkins. Isn't it wonderful when great kids come back and they try to come back and help after they're done with their careers? So it's really nice to see that one of your former athletes came back and sponsored this. And what you're doing is so worthwhile, and the fact that he feels the same way is great. So, but getting back to the topic, I do that religiously, and I feel very strongly about it. I really think that ultimately what we're trying to do with these athletes is find ways to safely achieve the intensities that they're capable of. And you can't achieve intensities if you're chronically fatigued. So, in short, in many situations, athletes never get a chance to really train as fast as they could or even as heavy as they could simply because they're overly fatigued. So, some people think of the deload week as a waste of time. Uh, Time that's maybe invested in injury prevention, and that is true to some extent. But what you're really doing is you're allowing the athletes to train better and with more quality during the times that they actually are training. So, it's not a waste of time at all. It's an investment in quality training. And if you're a true quality versus quantity person, as we should be, then this should make perfect sense to us. So often I really think that athletes never really get to train at the levels they're capable of training just because they're chronically fatigued.
Of course, periodization was such a common word being used. I've probably seen 30 presentations on periodization over the years, and I'm not exaggerating either. And now, we have what's known as block training. And so the terminology is always interesting to me. But generally speaking, if you have a 12 or 16-week cycle back in the day when we had these longer cycles, we'd usually do something different on the 4th week, whether it was adjusting volume, intensity, or a combination of the two.
Mhm.
So wanted to get your take on that. But also going back, we talked about the lower leg, and something kind of interesting came to mind when I saw that Oscar Pastorius had been released from prison. Oscar was the sprinter with the artificial limbs, and we talked about stiffness and we talked about the lower leg. And so it's been interesting to me to see, uh, the fact that he was so fast, but at the same time, I'd like to know how fast he was without these artificial limbs because they're made of some type of carbon fiber. Is that correct? How
Yeah,
familiar are you with that? And give me your kind of little comparison there with why he was fast.
I have some familiarity. First of all, um, the idea of stiffness in the lower leg and getting a response, elastic response out of the Achilles unit and so forth is a big part of being fast. So ultimately, there are different schools of thought there. There are many people who are sympathetic to Oscar and his plight and so forth, but there are also many who feel that he had a definite advantage, from the standpoint of the stiffness and the energy return from the blades being actually superior to that of a biological leg, and also the inability to develop acidity. Hydrogen ions weren't building up in the lower leg like they might in a biological leg. So there are definitely some advantages to it. Now, whether the advantages outweigh the disadvantages that are associated with the discoordination and the attachment linkages, leakage of forces at the attachment and so forth, that's very hard to say. And I'm not prepared to say he had an overall
Yeah.
advantage just yet because of the fact that that hasn't really been studied well. But it's unquestionable that there are some advantages to those types of to those types of devices. The interesting thing now is these same types of technology are now being applied to the shoes, and we're seeing tremendous improvements in sprint times as a result of these shoes. We're also seeing huge escalations in injury as a result of the shoes and the polycarbon fibers and such in the shoes as well. So it's an interesting time. And when they greenlighted these shoes in the track and field world, they kind of opened up Pandora's box to some extent. And I don't know if they'll ever get that toothpaste back in that tube, so to speak. Once you allow these types of things, but they made a tremendous difference. There's no doubt. Technology drives improvements, no doubt.
Yeah, I've seen those shoes, without metal, just look like a basic running shoe. Would you advocate that athletes train in those shoes? Would that?
Those new shoes, no, not all the time. They don't seem to be able to withstand it. And what I've been doing as a general rule is our actual time in those spikes, in the new type spikes, we're typically spending about one third of our training time in those spikes only. And the rest of the
Okay.
time we're trying to spend in normal traditional types of spikes and such. It just seems that the injury rates are far too high, and you accumulate overuse syndromes much quicker with these new types of shoes. So
Also, with what we were talking about was football skilled athletes and the program that would be optimal for them. But also, we're talking about other skilled athletes, not just football. But with regard to football, for instance, would you advocate during the off season, for instance, that these skilled football players use track shoes because they could learn better how to strike the ground?
yes, I do. Not necessarily the new technology, the polycarbon types of spikes, but I feel very strongly that an important part of really developing speed well is the tactile sensation that an athlete experiences between the foot and the ground. Being that they're very able to feel the ground well. I have noticed many times in my coaching career that uh, athletes that show decent running mechanics or decent acceleration mechanics when they're training in, say, flats, just normal tennis shoes or whatever. You put them in track and field spikes, and suddenly they're able to feel the ground better, and you see everything just sharpen up. And I think that's an important part of it, is to improve the proprioception and the tactile sensations at the feet and between the feet and the ground. So that's why I do feel that getting into those types of shoes is helpful if you're
Yeah.
really trying to bring speed to very close to a person's genetic potential. I think that it's helpful and maybe even necessary in some way, shape, or form. Now, I'm not saying that you need the polycarbon highest line spikes that you can possibly get, but some type of track shoe that's lightweight that enables an athlete to feel the ground better is definitely a help in that regard.
Right. And would you coach an athlete to strike the ground differently when they bound as opposed to when they sprint?
Yes. It kind of depends on the type of plyometric exercises, but generally speaking, plyometric exercises with the degrees of impact require differing types of ground contact patterns. So if we're doing something bounding in nature, particularly something horizontal, we're kind of hardwired as human beings to use the entire surface of the foot to dissipate those impact forces. This is why you see any athlete who's horizontally bounding and doing it well, you'll see almost a heel first rolling kind of contact so that they're using the entire surface of the foot in order to dissipate those types of forces. Now, this is one of the tricky things about teaching plyometrics in general is that different types of plyometrics kind of require different types of contact patterns. And a lot of it goes to the body's default settings as far as impact acceptance and how we're able to accept the impact and how we're able to dissipate those forces associated with impact. So horizontally, we see heel toe contacts all the time, and those are absolutely correct. And I teach those on a regular basis. Now, if you're doing a plyometric that's higher intensity but more vertically oriented, the geometry just doesn't work out as far as heel to toe. So what we do is we see more of a rolling kind of contact, but we really don't use the entire foot. We maybe use maybe the front half of the foot. We see contact kind of midfoot and a rolling action onto the toes there. If you're doing really low intensity type of jump work, things like jump rope or, things of that nature and with intensities like those, then being on the ball of the foot is perfectly fine in those situations. What I try to do is understand the type of plyometric I am using. I am trying to understand the levels of impact that are associated with that type of plyometric exercise, and I'm trying to teach accordingly. And more importantly, I'm always respecting the body's default settings. Anytime that our we anticipate high degrees of impact, that's when we tend to use more of the foot in order to dissipate those forces. And I try not to coach upstream, meaning I try to coach in concert with the way the body is hardwired, not against it. I was sent a video the other day of a young lady who blew an ACL, and they had a really hard cut off of her right foot. She went heel toe and made a really hard cut off of her right foot toward the left, and her knee went into valgus. And quite frankly, this was a cut that this athlete was not capable of making. Like she just, blew a gasket because she was too fast, and at that point to make the cut she was trying to make, it was a desperation type of move in the game. It was a rugby game. To make a long story short, the question I was posed by a couple of students was the heel toe the issue? If she had landed on the ball of her foot and used the plantar flexors as an amortization tool, would that have possibly saved her? And the answer is to me, no. I never want to teach an athlete to go against what they're internally programmed to do. I want to always make sure that I'm coaching and respecting the body's movement organization processes, because when you try to violate them, that's when you really get into some really weird stuff. And that's when risk jumps dramatically in those situations.
Would you be coaching striking the ground the same in a short horizontal bound versus an extended bound?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
the factor seems to be the trajectory as opposed to the distance involved. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm still
How
looking at
about
heel to toe
how
kind of
about a hurdle
contacts.
hop?
Hurdle hop is, if it's vertically directed as they typically are, is more of a midfoot type of strike rolling onto the ball of the foot. It's really
Okay.
difficult to have a true heel first, full-footed kind of landing in a hurdle hop just because of the simple geometry associated with the trajectories there. But we're still using most of the foot, and we're still using a rolling onto the toe type of concept there. The thing we're trying to stay away from in all situations is stabbing types of contacts, toe first types of contacts where we don't have an opportunity to amortize correctly.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm.
The I wanted to also revisit a little bit with, particularly with skilled football players or football players in general, the fact that they have a real problem with anterior pelvic tilt, and a lot of them have very tight hip flexors from being in a low position their whole life, and have a hard time opening up or learning how to open up, particularly running backs, for instance. But with regard to that, I got into a lot of drilling to reiterate proper hip position. And I also know that some people talk about being able to recover the leg if better if you do have tightness in your hip flexor. So, I don't know how much value that has in relationship to hip position, but hip position's always been extremely important for me. But when you get out there now and you see the drilling, you see what some people call pose chops. Our friend Jeff Hauser used to call a rapid knee lift. Uh, so one of the drills, I guess it was one of the famous names of a track coach, for instance. But you're getting into a lot of these scissors or switching type of drills, switching with triple or double contacts. I even did switching or scissors on a low box and then a higher box, but and I also would add an overhead object to keep behind the ears so that the hips would stay in a proper position. But I felt all these were valuable for football players because of their improper hip position and tight hip flexors. But what do you feel like this is something that we need to include in a training program, because we see this so often now with sprinters and hurdlers?
Yeah, football players are always going to be more prone to anterior pelvic tilt because of those positions. You know, defensive backs, who are backpedaling all the time, they live their lives in crouched positions, so you have lots of times where hip flexors are in shortened positions and the hip doesn't go into full extension. You see these types of things all the time. And because of the fact also that football players squat a lot, clean a lot, you also have a lot of tightness in the lumbar spine typically as well, which kind of contributes to the anterior pelvic tilt. So I've always felt strongly about taking football players during the off season and allowing them to use your term exactly, open up, meaning that to display big ranges of motion, to use drills that aren't necessarily as quick, but maybe emphasize ranges of motion better, to use exercises that challenge Golgi tendon organs, like ballistic stretches and such, to kind of get those things to open up and to get athletes to understand, to allow tissues to relax at the ends of the range of movement. For example, simple ballistic stretches like leg swings and things of those natures are very valuable. If
Yeah.
you take a typical football player who's overtrained, what you'll often see is at the ends of the range of motion in a simple leg swing type of exercise, as they get close to the ends of the range of motion, instead of relaxing and allowing the tissues to just stretch and let the proprioceptors do their job, what you'll see is they'll actually tighten the tissues up and they'll guard against that at the end of the range of motion. And that's typically a recipe for soft tissue injury. So to me, the ballistic stretches were always opportunities to open them up. The ballistic stretches were always an opportunity to allow them to understand how tissues are supposed to work. Tissues like to stretch. They like to stretch, and that's what they're built to do, basically. And it's when we tend to tighten them over time that these issues tend to come into play. So many of the soft tissue injuries are associated with this type of dysfunction. Now, you mentioned hip flexors in general. To me, I might have a little slightly different take on it. Is that what I have found quite often is that hip flexor dysfunction isn't associated necessarily with the tightness, I'm sorry, with the weakness of the hip flexors, but with the tightness of the hip flexor. If you stop and think about the way the hip flexor is designed to operate in sprinting, when you push against the ground and complete the stroke, the hip goes into extension. The hip flexors take a stretch, and that stretch, that elastic response, is what initiates the forward movement of the femur on the next stride. So hip flexors are designed to stretch and snap back, kind of like rubber bands, I guess we would say. what happens in these situations is our athletes often do so many drills that do not involve these stretch reflexes that these hip flexors tend to tighten up over time. So what I've found is that if we overdo exercises like A skips and B skips and high knees and things of that nature, what tends to happen is the hip flexor gets lots of work. At the same time, it doesn't get the work in the presence of the pre-stretch situation that it likes and enjoys, and as a result, those hip flexors tend to get fried over time. I do these exercises. I want to make it perfectly clear, but the answer that I've found in my program is to find a balance between forward work and backwards work. Now, sprinting isn't a problem, so that's not an issue. But in the drill work, I've started involving more and more backwards activities. So instead of just doing forward skips, I like to do backward skips. Instead of doing forward hurdle walkovers, I like to do backwards hurdle walkovers. When you do the backward stuff, your glutes and hands become the prime movers, and reflexively, you get relaxation in the hip flexors. So my issue, and whenever I see athletes who have a hard time opening up and have the tight hip flexor type of situations, that's when I try to increase the proportion of backward stuff that they do in warm-ups as opposed to forward stuff that they do. Generally speaking, in warm-ups, I'm normally working at about 50-50 forward to backward with the drills and stuff that they do. And that's my solution to that particular problem. And again, to be perfectly clear, the sprinting, you don't have to do backward sprinting because of the fact that sprinting does not produce the problem. It's only the drills that actually produce that particular problem. So if you're doing those types of drills and you have a reason to do them, that makes perfect sense. However, just understand that you're likely to have to do backward stuff to provide some type of prophylactic effect to the negatives that might be associated with it as far as hip flexor tightness are concerned.
Is there any specific stretch for that muscle group, for instance, that you like?
No, not particularly. Like I said, you can go ahead and have stretches, your simple, any hip flexor stretch will work perfectly well. But ultimately, the stretch that's most important are the ballistic forms of stretching, the more functional forms of stretching. So this is where exercises like your old iron crosses, and your eagles and your scorpions and your leg swings and these types of things where that hip flexor receives a ballistic load as opposed to a static stretching type of load are the ones that are going to help the most and be the most functional in that type of situation.
Yeah, and I've had PTs get into my iliopsoas. That's not real comfortable either.
No, and just about any football player or track athlete that warms up traditionally, like when they're on the table, if you put your thumb inside that iliac crest, they jump up off that table. It's not a pleasant
Right,
sensation. And most of the time they really don't even know that, that they're tight there or that they have an issue there. So it's funny. But I that's why personally with most athletes now, I really don't make a concerted effort to strengthening hip flexors, and of course, we do hip flexor work within the context of the entire kinetic chain, but I don't really like to isolate them because in most situations, I find they're pretty much overused and fried already.
right.
Mhm.
Well, I appreciate that information. I see these pretty much these same drills over and over again in
Mhm.
certain videos and so forth that are out
Yeah,
there. So
and I don't want to devalue them. I don't want
yeah,
to devalue it. Please understand that I'm stopping short of devaluing them. I'm just talking about the fact that every drill has a functional part of it and every drill has a non-functional part. If it was a totally functional, it wouldn't be a drill. It would be
right.
sport. So my point is that we just have to understand what we're accomplishing and what price we're paying. It's cost benefit, just like we do in everything else we do in our training.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. So I wanted to ask you about wickets.
Mhm.
So I think it was maybe Coach Anderson. I don't remember his first name at A&M.
Mhm.
That
Vince.
was popular for the incorporation of wicket drill. Can you talk a little bit about wickets?
I personally don't use wickets, and the reason why is because I haven't found the need. I feel that I do a pretty good job of seeing sprint mechanics, and I feel that I do a pretty good job of teaching sprint mechanics. And wickets, generally speaking, are a pretty good drill as far as controlling excessive backside mechanics and improving the timing of the recovery phase. So that's the whole idea of wickets. So when you put a wicket there, it's practically impossible to go into anterior pelvic tilt. It's practically impossible to overextend and recover late. So wickets clean up a lot of stuff. Of course, at some point in time, you got to be able to do it without the wicket. Now, wickets do have some negatives as well, meaning that I've noticed lots of athletes who have become overly front side dominant as a result of wicket work. And I've also noticed lots of athletes who fail to complete the push against the ground and they become premature with their recovery mechanics as a result of the use of the wickets. So wickets to me are just like anything else. They're a tool and they're not necessarily the coach, they're a tool for the coach to use. So
Right.
if you just put wickets out there and you expect the wickets to do your coaching for you from a sprint mechanics standpoint, you're likely to find athletes are going to run into problems and you're going to create a lot of other bad habits, opposite of the ones that you're trying to fix. On the other hand, if you understand what wickets are and you understand what you're really trying to accomplish with them, they can be a very valuable tool. Wickets are, Coach Anderson is the person who's credited most with, bringing the wicket philosophy, coaching philosophy into track and field. And if you're watching Vince use wickets, then you see him not keeping his mouth shut while the wickets are being run. He's constantly coaching and making sure that the athletes are completing ground strike and making sure that they're recovering on time and those types of things, and not just letting the wickets do your coaching for you. So just like any other drill, a drill is not the the drill's not the teacher, the drill is the classroom. The drill gives you an opportunity to teach. So I personally choose not to build my sprint mechanic teaching models around recovery. I prefer to build them around force application, meaning that I'm personally more concerned with the way forces are applied to the ground as opposed to the way we recover the leg after the forces are applied. So I typically don't use wickets, but I can't guarantee you that in 2024, in some point in time, that there won't be some kid that I run into that has some type of problem, and I might go to a wicket as a solution if I fail in other ways. So, so in short, those are my thoughts on it. Again, if you want detailed information or as far as wicket usage, I can't give you that because I don't use them. But I definitely see their use, and I definitely see their misuse at times. I made a lot of living as a long jump coach for many, many years, and the way the hip extends prior to the last two steps in a long jump determines very exactly how the penultimate step and the takeoff step are going to ground. And I've noticed that lots of long jumpers now who drill with wickets put those two steps down incorrectly because they become excessively front side dominant and because they don't extend the hip completely as a result of excessive wicket usage. So where there are dangers there are strengths there. And I would just advise athletes and coaches who are using wickets to be very careful and be very observant as to what you're exactly seeing with the wickets and just don't um, treat them as a mindless drill.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is more and more emphasis on that backside, both to open up the hip flexor and making sure that we're being able to apply, I guess you could say, as much force as possible into the ground. But again, getting back to that opening up that we were talking about, um, I'm curious as to what would be your primary cues for acceleration. I know I've seen you talk about climbing the ladder with the whole body as a unit. Um, what are some of your cues you use for acceleration?
Well, you just said it. I teach the acceleration as a climb. You have that hard body lean when you push off on that first step, and eventually we got to get to an upright type of posture. And I think it's important that athletes understand that the way to get upright is using the vertical component, not the horizontal, but the vertical component of your steps. And that means that the foot contacts have to occur in the correct locations. And more importantly, the direction of force application has to become progressively more vertical as you move through the sprint. So that's exactly the cue system that I use. I teach athletes to use what I call the climb, meaning that I want to feel that every time they push against the ground, that they feel an increase in the torso angle, an increase in the head angle, and an increase in the pelvic angle. And it's typically not that difficult. The problem comes when athletes have a misconception of how to get upright. Sometimes you'll see athletes in the acceleration process, and what they'll do is they'll lift the head and they'll lift the chest at some point in time in an effort to get tall. Well, lifting the head and lifting the chest is a problem because if you lift the head and lift the chest independently of the pelvis, that's the recipe for anterior pelvic tilt. And that's what prevents you from getting into good pelvic postures in your sprint. So ultimately, you have to be able to complete the process of using the vertical forces, the climb, I call it, in order to get your athletes upright correctly. This is a very important part, and maybe the single most important part of sprint and acceleration coaching. And again, it's a cue system that you have to have. Now, the tricky part of it, Jeff, and this goes into what we were saying a little while ago with the wickets, is that the thing that we forget sometimes is that we're not coaching in three dimensions. We're coaching in four dimensions. The fourth dimension being time. So often we see excessive backside mechanics. And what we'll do is we'll try to get an athlete to recover quicker or whatever the case may be. And we fail and then we go to wickets or whatever. But the thing is that ultimately the time variable is an important one. Quite often, the best cues in those situations are cues associated with stride frequency. If I see an athlete who I feel is striking the ground correctly in the first couple of steps, and for some reason, as the run progresses, I see excessive backside mechanics, well, then typically that's an athlete that does not exhibit enough of an increase in stride frequency. The stride frequency is progressing too slowly. So that's another variable that you have, and that's another cue system that you have associated with it as well, is how quickly or how patiently do you develop stride frequency. Most of the people who are over pushers, they're very simple. They are people that just get addicted to big, strong pushes and they don't develop frequency fast enough. Remember, when you push off of a sprint stride, every sprint stride has an ascent, an up component, and then a descent. When you push your body into the air, you go up and you go down. And then, of course, you contact on the next stride. If the strides come less frequently, then the descents become dominant. And that means we get the sitting postures in the backside. If, on the other hand, we time things up correctly so that the foot is in position to contact the ground on time, and we arrest or stop the descent portion of the sprint stride in a timely manner, then we can typically observe good postures and such. So this is another thing that I think we miss quite often is just the idea of frequency and how it affects the appearance of the sprint in those situations.
Yeah, 3 decades ago when I met Kevin McNair and he was coaching football players, he would talk about arm stroke being very important to, he'd talk about hammer and, all these different terms, but getting the hand through the hip. And so you'd get more extension on the opposite leg. And he'd talk about full extension of the femur on the opposite leg. But then we got into, okay, we don't want full extension. We want to get force into the ground and get off of it before we get full extension. Is that what we're talking about? Because, it's kind of two different things there. So
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because, backside mechanics typically has a negative connotation, but you got to have some backside if you're going to sprint correctly. I'm of the opinion, frankly, Jeff, that there is no excessive backside as far as the extension of the hip is concerned. Meaning, on every stride, I'm looking for maximal extension of the hip at top speed at maximal velocity. Now, I am not looking for maximal extension of the knee and the ankle to make that
right.
perfectly clear. So I want to make a differentiation there. But I do feel that every good sprinter does extend the hip maximally. And it's the chump change, like Lauren would call it, the chump change, the knee extension, the ankle extension that aren't quite complete. And when I see an athlete that shows excessive backside uh, due to excess due to the hip extension, that just tells me that the pelvis is out of alignment. Most of the time, what we see and we classify as excessive backside is normally poor pelvic alignment, anterior pelvic tilt. So I want to load the hip extensors, I'm sorry, the hip flexors elastically with a complete strike. And again, I'm looking for maximal hip extension, but not necessarily knee and ankle extension.
Gotcha. Well, that kind of leads us into starting positions. So I know that the crouch start is a very important training position for you because we know that the position that we come out of a stance and start is important to the rest of the run. And what I used to do on Fridays with football players is I'd group them in fours and I'd videotape it and I'd hit the whistle on the start and we'd come out of 3 point, 4 point crouch stand, lateral, facing away, one knee, two knees down, and basically I would score those and award the guys who won. Of course, we'd make a big deal about that on Monday.
Mhm.
But all these different starting positions. Can you talk about the value of a proper starting position when you're training?
Well, there's lots of different starting positions you should employ as far as your program is concerned. Now, when I'm looking at genuine, true high velocity training, I like to go to traditional track style starts. But the other starts that you mentioned all have tremendous advantages to them. And I think a lot of those advantages with those other types of starts, starting from one knee, I've seen, scramble stuff where you're actually lying on your belly and you have to scramble to your feet and start. These different types of starts are tremendously valuable because to me, these are the things that drive coordination and they improve the body's movement organization processes. For years, we've kind of thought in terms of uh, challenging agility and coordination with things like cone drills and things of that nature. And I know I'm going in a different way with this than you probably expected, but for years we kind of thought of shuttles and cone drills and things of that nature as the things that really drive coordination, and to some extent they do. But if I'm in line waiting for my turn, I can kind of look at that cone drill, put it in my mind, and kind of figure out how I'm going to do it. So, are we really rehearsing the body's ability to organize movement inherently, or are we actually practicing something that we've pre-programmed in our minds? Ultimately, a lot of the things that we do in sports and games are organized subcortically. A lot of the things we do in games are organized on the spur of the moment. And I think that's the value in these types of starts is that you're in unpredictable situations. You really don't have a recipe book in order to figure out how to get out of this situation and get into an acceleration pattern. So your body's got to figure it out. Subcortically, your body has to figure out an organization pattern in order to get us moving in those situations. This is why, to me, these types of things are the most valuable coordination development tools that you have, these erratic types of starts. You probably know this, but one of the things that I do on a regular basis with every athlete I coach in every single sport is I'll have them do body weight circuits. They'll do push-ups and sit-ups and those types of exercises. But instead of finishing the set of work with a whistle and a stop, what I'll do is I'll blow a whistle or I'll give them a command and they have to scramble to their feet and sprint 10 yards and then walk back and get ready for the next one. And they never know when I'm going to blow the whistle. They never know what position they're going to be in when they have to get into the sprinting pattern. And again, this is my way of challenging the body's movement organization processes in a way that enables them to feel challenged in that respect and doesn't give them the ability ahead of time to figure out how they're going to do it. Uh, Organizing movements subcortically as opposed to cortically. Back on the farm, we cut a chicken's head off, and it would still run around the yard. So that tells you that like running and some of these patterns are not organized in the brain. So we want to have things present in our programs that are going to challenge coordination and skill that aren't organized in the brain that we can't think of ahead of time in order to put that process out there. Things that are going to put athletes in more non-predictable types of situations. So this to me is the true value of all of this. I was very fortunate. I don't have a PhD, but I started one at one time. It got boring and I quit. But one of the guys that I was came into contact with is America's preeminent motor learning person for years, Richard McGill. And he made it very clear and showed out time and time again how if you supply variety in practice, eventually you increase the transfer into the test, meaning that doing the same thing over and over again perfectly isn't necessarily the best practice model. Doing variations of it that produce some stress and some strain and some problems to an athlete and challenge them is often the best way to go. Practice doesn't have to be perfect as in order to be productive if we're struggling to attain perfection. So that being said, sometimes we make practices too easy, and to me, that's what you're doing in those types of days. That's a wonderful construct. I love the idea of grading it, but the point is that by putting them in all of these different types of situations, you're introducing variety into the practice environment, and there's going to be some struggle there. There are going to be kids who have trouble getting out of certain positions, but it's
Yeah,
better than just giving them the things that they do perfectly.
no doubt. I used to love Fridays. I think I had 12 different positions that we'd start out of, and we'd run. I had them in groups of four. We'd run tens, one rep, and then we'd run 20s. So I think there were 24 reps, but particularly with the tens, we had to see the video to be able to tell who won. And then, if somebody jumped, they were eliminated immediately if we had to do another rep. So
No,
I really loved Fridays, and the guys would compete really hard. So that was some good stuff.
it's funny that as long as we've known each other, we've never talked. I don't think we've talked about this construct, but it's just funny because it's one of the things I love most, and it's amazing how we find out that we're so similar in our approaches there.
Absolutely. I'm happy for that because I always wanted to know if I was doing the right thing over the years. So yeah.
In my book, you have.
Well, next I wanted to kind of hit overspeed, and I got into this back in the day with Lawrence Seagrave with the ultra speed pacer that he came out with,
Mhm.
which
Yep.
anchored into the ground. And of course, I would only use overspeed for my very advanced guys,
Mhm.
and guys that did not typically pull up when you did anything intense for more than 30, 40 meters. So
Yeah, the guys that are built to sprint, so to speak, huh?
yeah, so I maybe had 6 8 guys, maybe 10 guys I'd use this with, but let's talk a little bit about that. Maybe maybe the optimum downhill running grade, for instance, if we wanted to employ a downhill run. And I don't really know what's out there right now outside of bungee type things. If there's something out there that you like, or just basically your opinion of overspeed generally.
Well, yeah, that's a interesting topic. Overspeed training is effective. There's no doubt. Now, there's risk associated with it, which is why your 5'10", 340-pound nose guard probably shouldn't use overspeed training. But with the athletes that have the body types and the sprint backgrounds, and you've brought them along and prepared them adequately to do it, it's a nice way to diversify your sprint training. Now, when we talk about overspeed training, I want to make it perfectly clear that um, overspeed training works, but I also want to make it clear that I feel strongly that the reasons why it works are much misunderstood. Back in the day, we thought that overspeed training worked because it made you move your legs faster, made you move your arms faster, and as a result of that, you got faster. But that kind of flies in the face of what really produces stride frequency. Stride frequency, or more importantly, increases in stride frequency, result because of increased elastic loading. Meaning, if I drive my knee up harder and faster, I get a bigger stretch on the hip extensors. So, therefore, when the knee reverses direction, it's going to move faster. When I push against the ground downstroke faster, I get a bigger load, elastic load on the hip flexors. So I'm going to get a faster return. So the real reason why stride frequencies increase is through bigger forces and bigger degrees of elastic loading at the ends of the range of movement. So the reason why we did overspeed training back in the 80s was probably incorrect. But it does not take away from the fact that that training seemed to be effective, and it was indeed effective for that matter. So my point and the way I look at overspeed training is going back to what Dr. McGill drilled into my head, that anytime you're trying to improve a skill, you're better off not just practicing the skill, but practicing subtle variations of that skill. And that's what overspeed training is. It's a way to make a more complex training environment of your maximal velocity, top speed training types of situations. So that's why overspeed training works. Now, for overspeed training to work, the assistance has to be extremely subtle. The absolute best overspeed training tool you have is the wind. If you're capable of, orienting the work that you do with the wind, and there's a wind present, then typically you don't really need anything else. My next favorite tool, is Overspeed Pacer. Like you said, that pulley system. I don't know if you can still buy it even, but it was so simple. It was easy to use, because of the pulley system. You could apply that very, very subtle type of assistance to an athlete as they were sprinting, and then downhill works as well. But if you go downhill, it's got to be extremely subtle, extremely subtle. If you're working on a football field that has a turtle back, you want about 1% degrade. So if you're
Yeah.
working on a football field that has a turtle back, if you start the kids under the goalposts and kind of angle them toward the opposite flag on the opposite end, that's typically about 1%. So that's an extremely subtle downgrade, but that's about all you want in an overspeed situation. The downhill running has an additional magic effect. Anytime you're running downhill, you every stride you hit a little lower than you did the stride before. So there's a tiny fall associated with each one that increases the plyometric demand of the sprint as well. So that's part of the magic of a downhill sprint. So all of those things can be helpful. All of them can be useful in these situations. And if an athlete is prepared, why not use some of them in order to make the training environment a little more complicated, to bring about a little bit more advanced degrees of adaptation in that
Yeah.
in that yeah. What's
Yeah,
interesting,
yeah, I would incorporate a very extensive warm up, about 30 minutes, and then
yeah,
require
and
the
and long
athletes.
term, yeah,
Yeah,
and long-term preparation too, meaning that the first day of sprint max velocity practice, you don't want it to be an overspeed day, but
yeah,
after they sprinted for a while as well. So you need short-term and long-term types of preparation. What's interesting is one time with my athletes, I did a little quick study. I had athletes sprint through timing gates, and then I had them towed, assisted through timing gates. I found that the athletes, when we told them through the timing gates, were actually at about 96%. So what I thought was actually overspeed was not overspeed. It was a little less than overspeed, but the training was highly effective. So that kind of maybe lends some credence to what I said about diversifying the practice environment is very helpful and is probably the secret as to why overspeed training seems to work very well.
yeah. I notice now a lot of coaches are going to fly in tens. It's kind of like it's caught on now. So, but I don't know all the reasons for that. Of course, I've used them similar things to that before, but it seems to be very common now. These fly in tens.
Yeah, I think I might be a contributor to that. One of the things that I do is regularly in my battery of tests is I'll have someone sprint a 40, and I'll take a 30 time, and I'll take a fly 10 time. Now, with the athletes that I work with, frankly, they're not at max velocity when they get to that 30-meter mark. So that 10 fly time is not a true, genuine measure of their maximal velocity capability, but it gives me an idea. It's close enough. And more importantly, it's safe enough where I can use that test at any time of the year. Whereas if I had truly gotten them to max velocity and then taken the fly time, that wouldn't be the case. So I would
Yeah,
have to wait until the athlete is really truly fit in order to do that test. So I'm wondering if the 10-meter fly doesn't come from that testing culture per se. But I
Yeah.
will caution your listeners about fly work. I see fly work done all the time incorrectly, and it's very, very troublesome. For example, I was working with an NFL team. I went to an NFL team, and they had a defensive back, and this defensive back was a track star in college at his university. Could run about 10-1 or so in the 100 meters. And they were doing 30-meter flies with a 20-meter excel zone. Well, if you're an athlete and you're capable of running 10-1 in the 100 meters, at 20 meters, you're nowhere close to your maximal velocity. So, because of the fact that they only gave him 20 meters to accelerate, that 30-meter fly was nowhere close to max velocity. So that's a mistake that I find being made quite often in fly work in general, whether it's 10s or 20 or 30 flies or whatever you choose to use, is that athletes are not given enough acceleration distance, and athletes are not taking the acceleration seriously enough, meaning that
Yeah.
they are typically not accelerating maximally. So when they get into the fly zone, they might be working as hard as they can, but they're not as fast as they can be. And what you think is a max velocity workout ends up being far short of a max velocity workout. You don't get the max velocity improvements or the tissue loading that you want from your max velocity work. So keep in mind that just an average athlete is going to hit max velocity around 40 meters. So if you're using a 20 or 30-meter acceleration zone with most athletes, you're not even getting close to their max velocity capabilities, and so you're not doing max velocity training in spite of what the paper might say.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of ins and outs through my career, but my ins and outs were short because I was just trying to get people to run tall.
No, exactly. Well, they're short, and I'm not exact. And I want to make it clear, Jeff. That's my philosophy. I'm not advocating longer max velocity windows. What I am saying, though, is in an in and out construct, you have enough sprinting distance to achieve maximal velocity.
Right.
That's the key to max velocity training. It's not that the windows of max velocity need to be long; they should be short. you know, but the time required to take it takes to get to maximal velocity and the distance needed to get to maximal velocity is typically underrepresented. When I set up my constructs, I typically do sprint float sprint, which is very similar to ins and outs. I'm only looking for 1 or 2 second windows of maximal velocity at the most. I'm looking for 10 to 20 meters with most athletes. That's short. That's a lot
Yeah.
less than what most people are doing. But I am giving them a lot of distance to get to maximal velocity. That's the thing that I want to make it perfectly clear that give them distance to get to max velocity, but the windows of max velocity need to be short. Like I said, 1 or 2 seconds is what you want, and you never want to go past three.
Yeah.
That's why I'm not a big,
Well, of
big fan
course.
of like 30 flies because 30 flies can kind of border on being a little bit too long.
And of course, football players are going to hit max velocity probably much sooner in some respects than an elite sprinter. But
Some will, but elite sprinters are hitting it around 55, 60.
yeah,
But I think like most of your skilled people in football, 40 is probably a pretty solid mark.
yeah,
Of course, your linemen, your linemen and your mid skill kind of people are going to hit it sooner typically.
I love 60s on an absolute speed day for skill guys. But you with some strength coaches with football players, man, as soon as somebody pulls up one time, man, that's nobody wants to do 60s anymore. So I mean,
Yeah.
but I love 60s on an absolute speed day.
Yeah, they're one of my favorite distances to work with too. Like most of the fly work I do, that's what I do. I do 60s when I want to do fly work. And sixes make sense because you get a guy to max, you get a kid to max velocity, they hit it around 40, it gives them about two seconds, maybe a second and a half at maximal velocity. So it's a perfect distance. But ultimately, the whole injury, everything you do is risk reward. So I just make
Yeah,
sure that my athletes have done lots of acceleration work before I do the max velocity stuff. Typically my rule is about 3 weeks of acceleration training before we hit max velocity. And the other thing is you got to be able to teach the mechanics. I'm pretty lucky. I haven't had a hamstring pull in my personal group in probably 30, 35 years. And
Right.
I give it, I credit it to three things. I teach the mechanics correctly. I make sure the athletes are flexible and mobile, and I sprint them on a regular basis so that they're always accustomed to it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I wanted to hit one more thing kind of hard before we close it up. Back in the '90s, I used to do a lot of video with my guys and sit them down in my office. And when they got rid of VHS, I really missed my device there. My cowboy where I could stop and slow mo and frame to frame. And
Hmm.
so I'm curious, if we break somebody down on video, of course, acceleration is going to be different at top end speed, but just for instance, with top end, we were looking at the position of, one leg is in stance and the other leg, we want it to be at a certain point, even with the other leg and so forth. But
Hmm.
when you break somebody down on video, let's say through acceleration, you sit them down in your office. What are you looking for? What do you want to correct? What do you want to look for as mistakes with body position?
Well, once we've started, what I'll do is and by the way, when I coach sprints, I typically look at one side of the body because it's just easier to see, and it's easier for them to feel. So most of the time I'm coaching one side of the body, not both, because it just feels slower to them and they can do it better. So I'm typically looking at like one side of the body. The thing that I look for most in acceleration is at ground contact, I look at the shin angle and I look at the torso angle, and I want to make sure that the shin angles progress and become more vertical. And I also want to make sure that the torso angle is never higher than the shin angle. The torso angle, the shin angle should be about the same. If that is the case, you're cool. If that isn't the case, if the torso angle is higher than the shin angle, that's the recipe for anterior pelvic tilt. That's a person who's lifted the head, lifted the chest prematurely in that situation. So that's pretty much what I'm looking for in those situations. The other thing that I'm looking for is maximal extension on those first couple of strides. And so we'll look at the pulse position and make sure that the athlete hits the pulse position. Once we get into max velocity, I again continue to look predominantly at ground contact. I look for a shin angle that is vertical at ground contact. I look for a tarsal posture that's vertical at ground contact. And the other thing that I look for at maximal velocity is the split between the thighs, meaning when the knee reaches its highest point in the front of the body, where is the other knee? Is it behind the body? I look for about 100, I'm going to say roughly 120 degrees or so, a split between the thighs. And I make sure that that split is properly oriented, meaning that I want to see the front thigh coming up pretty close to 90 degrees, parallel to the ground, and the back thigh about maybe 15, 20 degrees or so behind vertical in that point. So that's what I'm looking for. If I see that the front knee is not coming up higher than that, and the back knee is showing more backside than that, well, that's another formula for anterior pelvic tilt. So those are typically the markers that I'm looking for: shin angles, tarsal angles, and the openness, the degree of split between the thighs are the things that I'm looking for most in those situations. I like to tape it. Um, I also have some cautions about video because there's so much stuff out there on YouTube and all of these different places now that athletes are often getting bad information and such. So I try to like really sit down with them, and kind of guide them through their video study. I think that's an important thing to do. And quite often, the video that I have my athletes watch may not be video of themselves. It might be video of people that I think do things better than they do, and then trying to contrast them. So that's a big part of it as well. I do have one other caution for your listeners, though, when it comes to video. Remember, when you freeze a video, that's a frame that is only about 1/100th of a second. And if an athlete feels a position, typically they've been in that position too long. Lots of athletes have been kind of ruined because they're trying to hit positions that they saw on an iPad screen, and they're really not supposed to feel that position because of the continual movement nature that's associated with sprinting. So just be careful with your video usage in that respect. Understand that athletes have to feel things, not see things, and ultimately that's what you're trying to get them to be able to do.
Yeah, how about arm stroke and foot and ankle position with regard to that? Obviously, of course, I've heard Seagrave talk about that violent arm stroke on the first step coming out, and the arm which come here and so forth. And uh,
Yeah, I'm not a big arm stroke person, to be honest with you, Jeff. My whole philosophy of sprinting is the area of the pelvis and the thighs is the engine. From the knees down, those are your tires, and the upper body is a steering wheel. And I feel very strongly that if the legs are doing what they're supposed to do, the arms are going to kind of go where they're supposed to go. Because what the arms and the upper body do is they pretty much mimic, I guess you would say, the actions of what's going on in the lower body. They counter and they balance the movements of the lower body. So I'm not really a big arm person, to be honest with you. And I think that coaching the arms a lot is often overly simplistic. I have I've seen sprint coaches who teach the real dramatic split your arms at the start.
yeah,
First thing you do is split the arms dramatically at the start. And I know coaches that actually had a kid dislocate a shoulder because they were so violent in that movement, and that's kind of overdoing things. And if you pay close attention to an athlete in the start, all right, like if you're a track athlete in a blocks, if you really watch what they do carefully, like, you know, pull it up and look at it in super slow motion, you see that before they ever go, the back foot pushes against the ground and you get a little quick push against the ground with that back foot. The front leg, you see the shin rotate forward about 10 degrees, and that loads up the quad. So there's about 0.03, 0.04 of a second where you're doing things that are associated with the start, but you're not moving forward yet. And those things are valuable because they improve the quality of that push off. You see, so you invest about zero point zero 0.03 to zero point zero 0.04 seconds there. So if you're splitting your arms dramatically at the beginning instantaneously, you're moving the arms before the legs are actually moving and everything's out of sequence. If you pay really close attention to a really good block start, you don't see those athletes splitting their arms instantaneously. You actually see the hands moving up for about 3 to 4 hundredths of a second before you start to see the arms alternating. So let's be a little more sophisticated and let's look at what people are actually doing in good starts before we start making arbitrary decisions about drills and cues and things like that we ought to be using. If you don't believe me, Asafa Powell is typically considered the greatest starter ever. Like there's a super slow motion video of him on YouTube that's awesome. If you don't believe me, go look at it and see. So what I'm saying is that so often we just have this kind of surface level understanding of things and we don't look really deeply into what's going on and we make really bad choices with the cue systems that we use in those situations.
so are you saying what goes on with the arms is naturally what's happening with the lower body?
It's driven by the lower body, no
Okay.
doubt. And if you come to my practice and you see me coaching arms, I'm probably not coaching arms, I'm probably recoaching arms.
Yeah.
So if you're a person who wants to drive the arm backwards a little further because you feel like you're going to get additional hip extension on the opposite side, I get that. That makes perfect sense and whatever, and that's a cue system that's valuable. But just to get it without any respect to what effect it's going to have on the hip is not solid coaching. It's
Yeah.
not sound coaching.
Yeah, McNair used to talk about naturally hanging the foot, before, I got into all the people that were into, of course, the importance of dorsiflexion. So I thought it was interesting because he did have a very good background and so forth. So a very intelligent guy. Why would he talk about just naturally hanging the foot?
I think a lot of the dorsiflexion occurs very naturally, to be honest with you. And in
Yeah.
spite of the fact that I preach it, I don't spend a lot of time talking about it. Most
Right.
of the time when you see plantar flexion in sprinting, it's because the kids are too far forward or because the pelvis is out of alignment and they'll plantar flex to get the foot on the ground on time. So that's normally why you see the plantar flexion. It's dysfunction associated with posture and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Again, that's
Interesting.
respecting the way the body's kind of hardwired, I guess you would say.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I try to never forget that chicken.
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to never forget that chicken. Breaking sprint mechanics down is important to some extent, but there's just times in my career, Jeff, when I first started coaching, really good athletes, and they would sprint, I would coach. They would sprint, I would coach, and they got better and better and better. And there were years later when I didn't talk nearly as much, and they just got better without
Yeah.
me saying much. And I just realized that it's really the training, building the body to do what nature intended as opposed to teaching sprint mechanics. We shouldn't think of sprint mechanics as something that's really deep and dark and mystifying and something that's a foreign language that needs to be taught to some type of athlete. It's something that should be somewhat natural. Not to say that you don't coach, not to say that there aren't corrections that need to be made, but if it's like learning Russian or something like that, then we got the wrong uh, teaching philosophy.
Gotcha. Well, just one more thing I want to hit before we go, and that's we talked about the Olympic lifts, and I know you like to come from the floor with the power clean, but can you talk just a little bit about component variation movements to the Olympic lifts, and if you see any value in those? Now we got people doing trap bar jumps and talking about we don't want to receive the bar because we hurt the wrists and all that kind of stuff. But of
Yeah, I'm
course,
kind of, yeah, no,
having the benefit of absolute strength, power, and deceleration is something that I've always bought into. So can you just mention that?
well, maybe us old farts are wrong, but I'm right there with you. I am just sick and tired and done with people who are trying to find excuses not to Olympic lift. And frankly, I just consider it coaching laziness, to be honest with you, because you develop all the forms of strength in a complex and functional manner. I see more skill transfer from the Olympic lifts than anything else that we do in our training program from a skill standpoint, because you're teaching hip, knee, ankle sequencing, you're teaching upper body, lower body sequencing and such. And here's the thing that an Olympic lift has over a trap bar deadlift and things of that nature is that it's the only place you can truly challenge the sequencing. You know, you when you have athletes that are lifting light and they're showing you perfect technique on a clean, and then you ask them to max out, the technique tends to break down. Well, that's a call to action. That's a call to challenge that athlete in that respect. So what I'm saying is when I see athletes at the Olympic lift, I see those athletes breaking down technically in their sports skills in critical, crucial moments. Because Olympic lifting is where you teach them to keep the sequencing, the joint firing sequencing together in pressure types of situations.
Yeah.
So, like, I can relate this to basketball players who are missing jump shots in critical times because of the fact that the natural sequencing that Steph Curry, for example, has, isn't present at that time under that fatigue state or under that pressure type of situation. So, I see more transfer of skill and stability of skill transfer from the Olympic list than anything that you do. You kind of said I'm a from the floor person. I am, but I'm not, meaning that, yes, I will lift from the floor on a regular basis, but I also lift from below the knee and from the hang position as well. And I'll typically hit all three positions in the course of a week. If I have a heavy day and loading is important to me, I'll do a clean from the floor for the simple reason that enables me to load the most. It's the exercise you can do the most weight with. So let's pick that one. But on other days that are more speed based or whatever the case may be, you're very likely to see my kids working just second pull or working from a hang position. So I use them all and in
Yeah.
all different variations. People ask me all the time, which is better, a clean or a snatch? My answer is always both, because if they both have strengths, they both have weaknesses. If you're looking for speed or load, or whether you're looking for range of motion or whatever the case may be. And if you're going to train an athlete for a long period of time, months consecutively, you need all of those variations to supply variety in your program. So I think you need it all, frankly.
Yeah, my favorite variation was coming from blocks of 1.2 meters per second with the Tendo unit. which was probably about 76 to 79% in most cases. But I had so many guys improve that second pull. I think from that I mean, I had a kid did 419. I'm not talking about a hang clean. We're coming from the floor. I had probably 4 or 5 guys. 2 other guys did over 400. I had probably a dozen guys over 380 somewhere. I mean, so yeah, and very seldom did we have any kind of injury. So
No, you're right. And you talked about, if you're like if you're like coaching the quarterback and it's getting to a critical time of the year and you want to do pulls to protect against a wrist injury, I can kind of understand that. And, but I think we overvalue that way too much. If you live in fear of injuries all the time, then typically you're going to get them, to be honest with you. And so many of your injuries result in workarounds because you just were too afraid of them in the beginning. So ultimately, I understand risk management at certain critical times of the year, but suffice it to say, I'm an Olympic lift, and
yeah,
until I'm lying in that box, my athletes are going to be Olympic lift.
gotcha. Well, thanks so much again, and
It's
I'll be
always great,
looking
Jeff.
forward to part 3. So.
Yeah, looking forward to it, man. You take care, and it's always good to see you. Looking forward. We haven't seen each other face to face in a while. I'm looking forward to that
Yeah,
opportunity.
I want you to send me your schedule where you're going at times. I might get out there and have a chance to get out there and meet with you somewhere. So, love to know. Maybe if you're doing a clinic somewhere, anywhere near me, of course.
Okay, and for your listeners, if you want to find me, I'm on my website too, so you can
Yep.
find me there. Take care, buddy. It's always good. Thank you.
Okay, hey, this is Jeff Connors signing off for Absolute Empowerment this week. God bless. We'll see you later. And if you need a bass boat or you want to get out there on a pontoon, see my man Ed Watkins. Take care. See you next week.
You've been listening to Absolute Empowerment with Coach Jeff Connors on The Sports Objective. Join us every Monday night for a new edition of the show. Listen to the show pretty much everywhere podcasts are found. Be sure to follow us on social media at The Sports OBJ on Twitter and TikTok, at The Sports Objective on Instagram. Like and follow our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. As always, we appreciate you listening to the show. And go Pirates!